Well, all right. Welcome, all you amazing people out there in the woodworking world, to another installment of PK Woodworking. So today, I wanted to kind of go over shop safety a bit, just because I've seen a lot of things on YouTube, and some of them are safe, some of them not as safe as possible. So I've been using table saws for about 40 years, give or take, maybe a little more, sad to say. I think this is probably like my seventh or eighth maybe saw that I've owned or used for any length of time. And yes, it's a ridiculous saw, I get it, but I started on the most basic saw that you could have, like a crappy little job site kind of saw that my dad owned back in the day. So I think I've learned a lot over time working in a shop and also just doing this stuff on my own. So I wanted to cover some things about shop safety on a table saw. Yes, this is not a normal table saw. Many, though, of the things that I'm going to talk about are immediately going to connect with most of you. So I've got my top 20 things. Yes, that's a lot of stuff. 20 things that I think are really important about table saw safety. So first things first, don't clutter your table saw. Like, you can't be thinking about whether or not an offcut you have sitting over there from 2 projects ago is going to somehow get in the way of what you're doing with your table saw. You can't have things laying on your table saw that are going to get in the way of a cut. Those things are going to make you stop or do things that you shouldn't do in the middle of a cut and get you hurt. So clean your table saw off. Like, not everybody's shop is like all perfect and whatever all the time, and mine usually is a mess when I'm making things, but I'm just saying, universally, while you're using the saw, don't use the saw as your catch-all. Find something else, find a cart, find something else behind you that will work for you. So that's my first one. Second one is ensure that your saw is set up to the best of your ability. So what the heck do I mean? Ensure your saw is set up. So when your saw comes out of the box, sometimes it needs to be adjusted. The tabletop isn't exactly perpendicular or parallel to the blade, depending on the kind of saw you have. Maybe it's not perfectly flat. Maybe you don't have it adjusted so that the table's actually flat in your workshop. Maybe you don't have the outfeed table adjusted perfectly to the table itself so that when the wood goes through, it can catch. There's a lot of things that you need to spend time on ahead of time before you would ever use a tool. You wouldn't forget to tighten the lug nuts on your car before you decide to start driving it. It is the same thing when it comes to a table saw. So that brings me to amazing deals you can find on Craigslist, like mine, and other places. When you buy someone's saw, from a used perspective, don't assume that it is set up perfect. Take some time before you cut things on it and validate that it's actually set up right, that there are no loose nuts and bolts, that the belt is tight. All those things are really important when you buy a brand new saw. So make sure you do that. Secondarily, this is my third, ensure that you've got all the safety devices on your saw set up all the time. I know a lot of people on YouTube and other places say that they've removed the guard for filming purposes. I've worked in a lot of different places too. People just don't like guards in general, and they remove them, and it gets them in trouble. So this particular guard, you can raise or lower depending on where it is. And then there's a little adjustment knob on the backside over there that lets you swing this whole thing out of the way. I've had this saw for about a year. Never swing it out of the way once. I can't imagine not wanting to have it here. Let me give you kind of the pros and cons temporarily here. This saw has a riving knife right here. And so a lot of saws have a guard that's attached to the riving knife, and that's what irritates people. I get it. There are a bunch of overarm guards that are available on the aftermarket. There's one from a company named Harvey that looks almost identical to this. It's probably a copy of what Felder does on their saws and other people do on their saws. And then there's other ones from Excalibur that I think maybe they don't make them anymore, but you can find them on Craigslist. There's other ones, including SawStop makes one for theirs that works very good too. The benefit of having an overarm guard like this is that it's not connected to the riving knife. So literally you have no good reason to ever remove your riving knife, which is a huge safety perspective from a kickback. So I would just tell you, don't remove anything if you can get away with it. For this particular saw, when I get to a place where I can't use it the way I want to, I can still move it up out of the way a little bit so that the saw fence can move in, etc. But it still keeps me from trying to put my hands into the blade. So don't do that. For large, this is number 4. We're on to 4 now. For larger cuts, you got to envision your space. So for me, I've got this set up because it can cut large panels. So for me, if I'm going to cut a large panel, I got to move things out of the way in my shop. If I'm going to cut a big piece of plywood that's going to go farther over onto the actual rip part of the saw, I've got to move an actual machine out of the way. You have to really pay attention when you're doing this before you ever make the cut. Envision the space you're going to be cutting in before you turn the saw on every time. Number 5, very important, my shop's in my home. And so I have my sons and my wife that like to come out and say, hey, what's going on, Dad? What's going on, Paul? And so they've learned over time that you cannot distract me. Like, I'm usually not a very angry person, but if somebody tries to distract me while I'm focused in a shop, they're gonna see me get a little upset. You have to make sure that everybody around you, whether you're working in a shop with other people or your family, understand that if you're in the moment of making a cut on any machine, not a table saw, whatever else it is, it can wait. They can wait until you're finished, and then they can get in your line of sight somehow so they can wave you down and you don't do something crazy, okay? Very important. 6, never work in the shop before you're awake or if you're too tired, etc. Back in the day when I was in my early 20s, someone came over to my house, and maybe it was even earlier than that. Someone came over to my parents' house and wanted me to cut a piece for their subwoofer box out of some MDF. And I have witnesses that probably remember this. And so I was not fully awake yet. I was not really ready to work the saw, but the person was kind of pushing me. And I made a really terrible error about how I used a to use the rip fence. The rule out there for using a rip fence on a piece of wood is that the distance from the blade that the rip fence is should never be more than the width of the actual piece of wood you're cutting. And that just creates this kind of moment arm where the thing can twist, catch to the blade, and kick back on you. The machine I had back then, the saw I had back then, was not a newer saw, did not have a riving knife. It had a just a regular old guard like a lot of saws do, and I was not using it. And so I have a couple of witnesses of a piece of probably 22 by 24 inch piece of 3/4 MDF getting kicked back from that saw and hitting me right in the gut. And I was very lucky that the flat end of it hit me and not a pointed end of it. But I will tell you that I'll never make that mistake again. So make sure you're awake. Make sure you're not too tired and you're making that one last cut before you go back in. And by all means, never make a rip cut where the thing is narrower than the rip you're trying to make. That's a recipe for disaster. Number seven. Always have a healthy respect for the tool. Like, I don't care if you have a saw stop. I don't care what kind of saw you have, if it's got a tiny little blade or a gigantic blade. You have to have a healthy respect for the saw before you ever get to it. I don't care how long you've been using a machine, you have to realize in your head that this thing can create some damage. And so if you don't come to the saw every single time feeling that way, you're going to get complacent and you're probably going to make errors. So I always am crystal clear about that is on this saw currently right now a 12-inch blade with lots of teeth, and it's not friendly to my fingers. And when I put bigger blades on this machine, when I'm cutting thicker things, it's even scarier. So make sure you have a healthy respect of what the saw can do. Number 8, if your saw has safety features, use them. So for instance, if you have a saw stop machine, by all means, make sure that you're using the saw stop and not defeating it because you're worried about whether or not the actual cartridge is going to fire off or not. Like if you bought the machine with that feature, use it. This machine has a feature that a lot of saws have that are like, that have a unifence style saw or saw fence where you can pull the fence back, lock it in, and then use it as kind of a, like a stop. And then what the cool part is if you're going to use it, you have it so that it's stopping before the blade starts, and your offcuts are never going to get bound in between there, fly off, hurt you, etc. So if your machine can do it, use those safety features. Whatever the safety feature is in your saw, or safety features are on your saw, use them. I bought this clamp system for my saw that's really helpful with straight lining wood and cutting sheet goods, that gets me way far away from the blade because I can hit a button and clamp them and then keep myself away from the blade. Use the safety features that your saw has. Okay, number 9, keep the saw blade as low as you possibly can while you're cutting. Sometimes I see people with the saw blade incredibly high, and I can't understand. Like, there's no good reason for that. I know people say, well, the angle of the blade, it cuts better. Get a higher powered saw. Like, do something different. Like, this is not the place to like buy something that's a bargain piece. Buy a bargain sander. Don't buy a bargain saw. I can adjust because this saw is kind of techie, I can adjust the height of this exactly to where I want. But in every other saw I've had before, the crank is right there. Just don't have it higher than it needs to be. That's just common sense, I think, in my point. If the operation doesn't, this is number 10. Number 10, if the operation you're doing doesn't make sense, or your spidey senses are going off like, what the hell am I doing? You should probably stop and rethink what you're trying to do. Let me give you a what if. So if I'm trying to cut something very narrow and I move this fence in as far as I can, and maybe I've got like a 1/2 inch piece of wood that I'm cutting. Man, that's a scary thing if you only have a little piece on the outside and a little piece on the inside. Like, I would immediately think, okay, do I need to make this piece of wood longer than the pieces I actually need, so I can stop the cut if I need to before my push stick or my hands or anything even get remotely close to where that blade's going to be? Can I do it on a different tool? Can I do it on a bandsaw? Can I do it in a place where it's just a safer kind of way to work? So every time I'm doing something on any tool that I have, I'm always thinking about, is this the right tool for the job? And then, is it the safest tool for the job? And before you go off and do it, try that. So number 11, offcuts drive me insane. I just hit my mic, what an idiot. Number 11, offcuts drive me insane on YouTube. I gotta be honest with you. Like, this is one of the reasons why I probably did this most, so why did I make it number 11? I have no idea. Offcuts drive me insane. I see people on YouTube that are swiping at their saw to move like offcuts away. And I just, first of all, I know that the depth of field on a camera, often it can kind of fool you to show you maybe the person's hand is not even near as close to that as it really is. But I would tell you that there's no good reason to get rid of an offcut in those scenarios. You should be doing something different. If you have a saw that has a fence like this, that you can move it back so the offcut can't get bound up in the blade and moves away, then there you go. If you don't have this style of fence, and let's say, for instance, your fence only lets you, like a Beismeyer fence, only allows you to, well, maybe if I can get this in here, only allows you to have the fence in this particular direction, then, that was my wife, everybody. Then I would just tell you, there's ways to put a sacrificial fence in this, and there's ways to put stops that come out and give you extra space in the fence. do those things. Don't like decide you're not going to do those things. Okay. Sorry, everybody. That was my wife talking to me for a second. So listen, there are all kinds of tools out there to help you with offcuts. And one of them is something that I got from Felder. And I know that Martin sells this. I think this is actually an Einer product or whatever. Anyway, it's got 2 magnets on the bottom. You could easily make it with a mag switch. You could buy the little tools for it. And basically, it connects like that. And if you had this not in such a close place, like if you had this, I can't reach that far. If you had this farther away, as the offcuts come near the blade, this little deflection arm just pushes them out anyway out of the way. So like, and this is pretty cheap. Like this isn't an expensive thing. And you could probably make this yourself because we are woodworkers, also pretty cheap. And I just keep it right there so I always have it with me. Do not swipe at your saw. It just makes no sense. So I want to show you one thing also about this particular saw that is kind of maybe common in a lot of European saws and probably getting more common in other saws. But when you start the machine, you'll hear it's 3-phase. So you'll hear it start its 3-phase thing here in a second. Right there. Now it's all 3 phases are working. And when I hit the stop button, you'll hear the brake go on. And on this machine, it's a 10 horsepower motor, so it's pretty aggressive. You'll hear it stop the blade pretty quickly. So 1001, 1002, 1003. Basically, in 3 seconds, that blade is stopped. So the idea is you don't want a freewheeling blade. If you think about this, if your machine has a blade brake like that or a machine brake like that, there's no good reason for you to swipe at the top of the saw to get rid of your offcuts. Turn the saw off and then go back to working again afterward. So, yeah, that's offcuts. So, 12, number 12, 10 and 2. I'm all about the push stick. So I've got the push stick that came with the saw. I don't believe the person that had the saw before me used it very often because it's pretty not messed up. And I've ordered more. I'm waiting for them to show up. I use this all the time. All the time. It's a no-brainer, especially on this saw where you're on the other side of the saw most of the time and your hands aren't and your body isn't in that way. I use this all the time. Now, I will also tell you, on this kind of a saw, you do much more of the work the saw does on this side of the saw with your hands away from the blade, so there's really a little less need for this than there is on a regular table saw. But what I am getting at is make sure it's always there. Like this is cool, it's got a little place on it for it to automatically go to all the time. But on my older saws, I had a Beismeyer kind of fence on one of them. I had a unisaw kind of fence on the other, unisaw fence or unifence on the other side. They always have a little place on top where you can put a, something to write with, or you can put something like a push stick. Well, I've had many. I've had regular push sticks. I've had ones I've made. I've had a gripper before. All of them way better than your hands, so just use a push stick. Zero clearance inserts, which brings me to a great conversation because I don't have one here yet. I'm waiting for someone to make one for me because this is a little more complicated than a regular like saw is. But a zero clearance insert is really kind of important. There's a lot of good and bad on YouTube about this, like that, hey, a zero clearance insert doesn't allow for a whole lot of space for the dust to get sucked down into the saw. Some people have come up with throat plates that go around the blade that have holes drilled into them that are pretty cool ideas. Here's what I would say. Without a zero clearance insert, thin slivers of wood that are coming off of your offcuts very easily can get stuck in those areas, and that creates for a panic situation where you do something that you don't normally do when you're cutting. So if you're pushing a piece of wood through and all of a sudden an offcut goes down into the place where you would have a zero clearance insert that would keep you from doing that, or from that happening, I should say, all of a sudden you've got a piece of wood sticking up straight here and you've got wood that's coming through this side, and now you're making a decision in the middle of a cut when your hand's near the blade, like what am I gonna do? You don't want to make what am I going to do decisions while you're cutting a piece of wood. So a zero clearance insert, highly recommended. You can make them yourself. Many saws, you can buy them as accessories for them automatically. So highly recommended. Get a zero clearance insert. Number 14. 14. Lubricate the surface of your saw. So this particular saw has a cast iron, fence right here. I mean, it's cast iron fence, cast iron table right here. And so it allows for you to put some kind of a lubrication on this to make it easier to push the wood through. And if you're trying to do something with a heavy piece of wood and you've already got the wood pushing against the blade, which sometimes is a challenge to begin with, and then you also have the friction of the top of the actual saw surface, not a great thing. So there's about 10,000 different things out there that you can lubricate it with. I think the most basic one is paste wax. A lot of people use paste wax on the top of their saws, but it's another one of those things just to make sure that your saw is set up the correct way. Always have these surfaces lubricated so that you're not having to force against the friction of the top of the saw and the blade too. So that's number 14. Number 15. The setup of your tool usually takes longer than the cut. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's a shaper or it's a band saw, a table saw, a router. I really don't care what it is. Most of the time, the actual setup takes longer than the actual cut does. I say just think about that for a second, because spend that time thinking through what you're trying to do, what safety things you can add in. Can you add in some kind of a tool that would help you, like be safer, like this for offcuts? Or if you had the table saw where a feather board would make sense, where can you put a feather board to help you with? Or just think about it. Like, sometimes this isn't a race. It's more about setting it up correctly and getting it done the first time the right way, which is just dovetails right into the thought of measure twice, cut once. It's the same thing with this. Take some time and set it up correctly. Dust collection is your friend in a shop. I have a Cyclone that's buried back behind the camera back there that does a really good job of getting rid of all the dust. It's good for your lungs, of course, but it also makes it safer when you're actually doing the work. I can see where the blade's at when it's getting the dust collection taken. The dust collection is taking the dust away really well. It's not going to get in the way when I'm trying to cut something like a second time. So I do my first cut, and then all of a sudden there's a ton of sawdust all over the top of the table, and I see people swiping their hands again at the table saw to try to get rid of some of the dust. I mean, don't do that. You're setting yourself up for something bad. I would rather you grab an air hose and blow off from a distance than do something like that. But I would just say, figure out a way to get your table saw to get as best dust collection that it can afford you with the way it's designed done, so that makes it safer for you to breathe and also to work. So, number 17. So number 17. This is going to sound pretty bougie from me at this point, but buy the best saw you can buy. Buy the best tool you can always buy. I say that you cry once, like instead of crying every time you use it, just cry once with how it hurts your wallet. I would just say that the more stable the machine is, the safer it's going to be. The more powerful the machine is, believe it or not, the safer it's going to be, because the blade's never going to get stopped because of something that's going on. You're not going to have to worry about binding the same way. There's so many benefits to doing that. I would just say, buy the best machines you can buy. Sometimes that means finding them used, like I did. Like I got this probably for a third of what it would be new. Still was very expensive, but I would tell you that it's worth every penny, because I feel safer every time I use it than I did with the previous saw I had, which was still a great saw. So buy the best you can. Blow me up. I know, tell me I'm being crazy, whatever. Number 18, lighting is very important. Working in a poorly lit shop isn't fun. It's hard to see what you're doing. As you get older, you don't see as well either, so I'm on that train also. But right now, lighting has really come down in price. The amount of lighting you can get in LED strips compared to what you could do with fluorescent 5-8 years ago is kind of remarkable. You don't have to create all kinds of circuits in a room anymore. Now they all daisy chain to each other and plug in pretty simply. So it's really important to be able to see what you're doing. And I think that that's just kind of sometimes overlooked when it comes to a saw. You don't want any kind of shadows on the saw while you're working in it. So lots of light is always a benefit. Number 19, getting close to 20 here. Keep your clothes and your hair and your smock and whatever else you've got going on, your sleeves, your gloves. Make sure that they're not something that's going to get stuck in the tool you're using. Like you don't want to have your hair in a bundle, or if you have long hair, or big bulky jackets or whatever that hang out. I don't know what would happen if your clothes got stuck in a blade that was spinning on a very powerful saw. That's a lot of inertia, and it would be terrible for someone to just get sucked down and into a blade because of their clothing. So just make sure you don't have loose fitting clothing, hair hanging down, smock not tight enough to you, all those kind of things. And then lastly, number 20, turn the saw off between all of your operations you're trying to do. So if you're trying to cut something and then you want to adjust the fence for a different width, length, height, whatever it is that you're doing, or a totally different use for what you're cutting, turn the saw off. Like you can leave the dust collection going, who cares? But turn the saw off in between those times to move around. You see a lot of people moving wood in between. They're moving their rip fence over. They got a piece of wood coming on. And I've seen many times people talk about like the wood just hit the blade and I wasn't ready for it, and then it shoots itself into you. And yes, there's lots of accidents with people who put their fingers into a blade on accident. And that's why SawStop exists. And now other companies are coming out with technology to solve that too. But it still stands that kickback is one of the biggest things that happen on a saw that can hurt people. And so don't think just because you have a SawStop that you can't get kickback. You can get kickback on any saw. So think about that. Kickback can also happen when you're not even in a cut. Like I said, you're moving the saw around, you're moving the piece of wood into place before you're gonna cut. Turn your saw off, get the piece of wood where you want it to be, turn your saw on, and then go for broke. So look, thank you for putting up with me for these 20. And I feel much better about like getting this off my chest. And if you've got any comments, please make sure you put comments below about things that I missed or I could have done better. So thanks again for putting up with this and listening to me talk about the things that I needed to get off my chest with regard to the safety stuff. I didn't mention a first aid kit. That's automatic. I've got a first aid kit right in the corner. Also have a plan. Make sure that you know what the local place around you that can take care of you the best way possible if you do have something like happen to you on one of the tools in your shop. And make sure that your family knows too, because sometimes you're going to be probably in a little bit of a shock when something like that happens to you. If it happens to you, I hope it never happens to you. Subscribe, please. I think we're done.